Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason. With me today is my co-host, Janelle Blue. Janelle is the president of our sponsoring organization, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. And with us as our guest is Carol Petranek. Carol is one of the assistant directors of the Washington, D.C. Family History Center, which actually is in Kensington, Maryland.
Yes, it is.
And Carol has told us in another show about her experience with scanning and filming records in Greece. And today we want to talk about a problem that probably almost all of us have at one time or another, is finding the village or the county where our ancestors originally came from in mostly Europe, but other foreign countries. So, Carol, we want to talk about a variety of records during this presentation. Anything that you really want to specifically point to us to how to get started?
Well, first of all, I think most of us are aware that when our immigrant ancestors came here, many of them Americanized, meaning that they adopted the culture of this country. It took a little longer to adopt the language. But one of the ways that they were able to meld into American society was to make their name a little more American sounding rather than a long European name, which could be difficult in Central Europe with all the vowels, in a country like Greece with the Papadopouloses. You know, these names were shortened. Also, they did what I even find myself doing, which is somebody says, well, where are you from? And instead of saying Silver Spring, Maryland, because nobody knows where that is, I'll say, oh, I'm from the DC. I'm from Washington, DC. Yes. Well, I'm not. I'm from Silver Spring, Maryland. But our ancestors did the same thing. Instead of saying the little village that nobody knew of in this country, they would say the larger city or the larger jurisdiction that people most likely would have recognized. So this makes it really challenging when you're ready to jump the pond because you don't know really who you're looking for or really where they're from. So for my personal research, some of the collections that we're going to talk about and have a conversation about today were critical in being able to pinpoint exactly where my grandparents and great-grandparents were from and what their original name was, not the Americanized name. And Janelle, well, you had a similar situation with your family.
And in fact, that made me think about the fact that I found my family in a small village, and that's because one of the birth records that was on Family Search named it because of that particular church. But many of the records that those people gave later on were either Germany, Prussia, and this one person said Bromberg. Well, Bromberg wasn't where he lived. It was the name of the place where the church records were, the sort of what they call the crease. And so so he just named that because he probably figured that would be more familiar, I guess, to whomever. And that was in his naturalization record.
The one record that you would think would have absolutely the exact location of the birth because they're asked, where were you born? Challenging, very challenging.
So,
well, I think we can start with this first slide that will show us all that really we need to find our ancestors in every U.S. record where they could possibly exist.
Exactly.
And each record holds different information. So there may be a clue in one record that is not in another one because that question wasn't asked, or that person who was giving the information was in a different mindset that day to give the actual village instead of just saying Berlin or Sparta or something.
And this is one of the things that I tell my beginning students. Unless there's really, it's an off-the-wall chance, look, because you never know what you're going to find. And I have found things that I didn't expect to find because I went and looked at a record, more because I wanted to eliminate the fact that I was going to get something helpful. But lo and behold, I found something. So it really is important to look at everything we can.
Well, why don't we start with I start at the beginning. Let's start with a birth record. Like, take a look at this slide. This is my father's birth record, and look at all the errors on it. Instead of giving the correct name, it was given a shortened name, which my family never used. So even though it's an official government record, we do have to look at everything with a critical eye.
Now, would that have also been in the church record as well?
Well, the church record's something different, and
So the name wouldn't connect? It would be exactly the same?
no, there was an error on my dad's birth record that
okay.
was later connected. But yes, there are church records which will either verify, or in the case of foreign-speaking family members, will, if it's a church that's foreign-speaking as well, they will write the name as it was in the original language. And they'll write the village as the people named that village, but they will write it in our Greek church. It's written both in Greek and in English.
Okay.
Now, in the Germans churches, is it written in bilingually so that you have the original spelling of the name and the way the village is spelled in the German records?
If the German churches in Texas, which is where I grew up, they're not, it's all German, so it's all just Germany to them.
Okay.
So I had to go back to the original record to be able to see, because most of those did say the village, and maybe the way you would find it in Family Search would be Bromberg, which is the crease, but then when you go into the record, it would say the exact village where that person lived.
Very good, very good. That's so important. And what about death records, death certificates? This next slide will show you an example of where we can find death records, because they're not just the death certificates, but look at the will and probate records. Look at cemeteries and gravestones. This is a photograph of my mother's father's tombstone. It has his name, his Greek name there, not Pappas, that he used. So you never know. You just never know what you're going to find. Funeral home registers, the cards that people have, the obituaries. I've found village of origins and obituaries.
Yeah,
Yes,
death
yes.
notices.
Death notices?
All of those things are so important, not just for villages, but for anything that might give you clues to the person in their life.
But fair warning about the obituaries, because that's descendants who are writing those, and often
Correct.
they might not get it exactly
Do or
right.
don't. Yes,
That's
I've
correct.
seen more. That's why I have offered a course in writing obituaries for people.
And have you been taken up on that? Or people
Yes,
just-
I have offered it 3 or 4 times through the 2 societies, and part of it was because even though I wrote my father's obituary before he passed away and he looked at it, afterward we still forgot that he had served as president of the band association that my sisters were in. We got all his other civic organizations, but we missed that one. And so, I wrote them. I've written my own. I need to update it, but because it's been probably about 10 years. But yeah.
Well, there is and of course with death certificates, what's the first caveat that we tell people?
You don't believe anything other than the death information, and
Yeah.
even then.
Absolutely, absolutely,
The
because
date?
it all depends on the informant.
That's
Yeah.
exactly
And what they
right.
know. Well, let's move on to marriage certificates and marriage documentation.
Oh, the German records that I found in Poland are priceless, because they usually will name the father, at least the father, often the mother and her maiden name,
Yeah.
and of course it's names the village too. So that's a wealth.
And you hope that they tell the truth on there.
That's right.
As I mentioned before when we were talking, I have my great-grandparents' marriage certificate. The parents, who I'm assuming they gave their parents' names, neither set of parents for my great-grandmother or great-grandfather have I been able to get them to lead me to anything. The 3 witnesses on the certificate are supposedly family members of my great-grandfather. They've been dead ends.
What age were they? Were they at age of consent?
They were, yes, they were in their early 20s.
Okay, because I was going to say
Yeah,
maybe
no,
they
no,
made it
you
all
know,
up so that there wouldn't be a
if it
question.
was that, no, you know, that was my father's parents, and this is my father's mother's parents'
Oh,
marriage
gosh.
certificate.
We
But
hope they didn't lie,
Yeah.
but sometimes they did.
they did.
As you unfortunately are experiencing. Well, I have found in my personal research that the census records are really very, very helpful to lead me to other records.
Right.
Especially the 1900, 10, 20, and 30 census records, because they ask specific questions about immigration and naturalization. Oftentimes, as I work at the National Archives, I see people come in, look at census records, and they're fixated on the left side of the record, which is the family names and the ages. But they don't always look at all the columns, and so they're overlooking important information. So the immigration and naturalization questions that are asked on the census records can lead people to those passenger ship records and naturalization records. So, why don't we talk for a moment about immigration and passenger ship records? I actually have a slide on that presents some of the information that you'll find on these passenger ship records.
Backing up for just a minute, I want to say, though, that it's important to look at as many census years as you can, and then do a spreadsheet, compare those, because you're going to find that it is not consistent. The ages are not consistent, and other things on there. And so then you've got to work through that and to help figure out what is the right thing.
Like one of my other great-grandfathers, who says he was an alien, then says he's naturalized, then says he's an alien in 3 censuses.
Oh.
And the 4th census, he didn't say anything because he died 4 years before it was taken. But, you know, you hope that they answer the questions, whoever, because there again, we have to understand, we don't know for sure who answered the questions.
Correct, on the census.
You know, in
Right.
his case, chances are he probably was not the one answering those questions.
He was probably at
It was
work.
probably his wife.
Or it could have been a neighbor.
But it
Or
could,
it could have
well,
been a neighbor, yeah.
that one is one that people often put it off to, but that you really have to analyze and really think about, did the neighbor really answer
well,
the
are
questions?
the neighbor
I mean,
equivalent? Maybe
yeah.
maybe it was
you
the
know,
youngest
but
child.
it could have been, it could have been the kids in the kids in the family.
All right, so passenger ship records are really something that we all look to. There was a slide on that just a moment ago that showed us that in 1906, the passenger ship records wrote the exact place of birth, of course, depending on what the person says. In 1907, who's the closest living relative in your birth country? And what's your alien status? Are you going to come to the U.S. temporarily or permanently? So if your ancestors came in 1906 or after, these passenger ship records can really be phenomenal, especially the closest living relative in the birth country, because they'll give the name of the individual. So that will prove that your ancestor was in that region at that particular time.
One of the other things that can be helpful with this too is if you have family members, mine came earlier, so I'm not getting that information, but if you had family members go back to visit those family members,
Oh, yes.
you may find them. I have this with my Scottish ancestors. My great-grandfather and grandmother didn't go back, but my great-grandfather's 3 sisters went back a couple of times to see their oldest brother who stayed in Scotland. So that can help, and that's why you really
Maybe
need to
passports.
look at the entire family.
Yeah.
And my ancestor, so the different families that were in the larger family came at different times, and this was like a 1897 immigration record, ship's manifest. Well, it didn't tell me very much, but told me one thing. There was a question that said, who paid for the passage? And that is how I could prove, because the person that they named was the other ancestor who was already here. It was a perfect way for me to be able to correlate that.
Absolutely.
That's rare, though. Most of the people on that manifest, it didn't say.
Yes. Well, you were lucky.
I was
you hit the
lucky.
jackpot on that
For
one,
once.
didn't you?
Yeah.
Well, what about naturalizations? Naturalization records are the things that I always steer people to as a really important source of original name and place of birth. So have you had experience with naturalization records and finding your ancestors on those? When we talk about naturalization, we're talking about several documents. The declaration, the petition, which would have the information that the immigrant answered questions to, and then we can chat for a minute about derivative and naturalizations and military ones. But just in general,
and there again, it depends on the time period, because if they came before the 1907 change in the law, you probably are not going to get a whole lot. My great-grandfather, who came in 1885, waited until 1904 to become naturalized, and all I have is that he was a citizen of Scotland, even though he was naturalized in the federal courthouse, not the county courthouse.
Well, we should talk about that, because one of the things that frustrates people as I work with them at the Family History Center at the National Archives is they'll say, well, where can I go find my ancestor's naturalization record? And I'll say, well, it depends. They could have started in one court, they could have finished in another court, they could have started in a federal, a state, a local court, and completed the process several years later in a different court, even in a different state.
Right.
So it is a challenge to nail them down, but Ancestry and Family Search and MyHeritage now have some naturalization records online, and a lot of the states are putting naturalization records online as well. For the National Archives itself, people need to know, because they come into DC and they ask us, can I get this naturalization record here from California? And what they need to be aware of for a National Archives is that those records are dispersed in the National Archives regional offices. So they should check the regional National Archive office that has jurisdiction over the area where their ancestor lived.
Right. If you can get a hold of a declaration of intention, it's got some really good questions. Whether those things get filled out.
Once that federal law went into effect, there are fantastic questions on there.
But I haven't been able to find that hardly at all on my ancestors. I may have the certificate, but that doesn't tell you very much.
Yeah.
So I'm still looking.
You're still looking. Well, one record collection that I find is extraordinary is alien registration files, and people are not very familiar with those. There's a slide that talks a little bit about the type of information that is on alien registration records, or A files. The A files were instituted by the federal government at the beginning of World War II. At that particular point in time, the federal government took account, and everybody who was not a U.S. citizen in 1840 had to register with the federal government as an alien. So if your ancestor, grandparent, or great-grandparent, if you're younger, was not a natural citizen in 1940, there's a chance that they may have an A file. And in those A files are incredible documents, photographs. They had to register, fill out forms like the one that's showing up on the screen right now. They had to, every year, they had to register at the local post office with the address that they're living in. There's affidavits from family members. There are marriage, birth records. They had to prove that they were who they were and that they were not an enemy of the United States government. So these files are kept in the National Archives office in Kansas City. And you can do a search on the National Archives catalog by just typing in your ancestor's name. And if there's an A file for them, that name will come up and it will say A file. And at that point,
to
you
know.
can contact the Kansas City office and get that information. Those are gold mines.
Yeah.
I have a grand aunt who has a 48-page A file. 48
Why?
pages.
Why so many pages?
They just asked a lot of questions. She answered them. There's lots of documentation there. So that is a little known record collection that's not well understood. That could really be a boon for some people looking for this information.
Well, I would assume that there was a rush to naturalize right before that,
Yes,
too.
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. So another record collection that people don't think about very often are Social Security applications. This next slide will show you why they're so important. This is what your ancestor filled out, and including the information such as if it was a husband, if it was a woman, what was her maiden name? If it was a husband, what was his wife's maiden name? It will give you the birthplace, their birth year, etc. So there are two types of Social Security records. There's this original card that's on the screen, and then there's the computer printout of any time you made a change to contact the Social Security office. Oh my goodness, I got married, so now this is my name, etc. So people should get both. And these are available to them through the Freedom of Information Act. So anybody can get a Social Security application and also request the Social Security printout.
How would you do that through the?
Socialsecurity.gov, SSA.gov.
Okay, and then they will give you the original application.
Well, they'll give you a
copy
of it, as well as the computer printout. So there's a separate charge for each of those. I think it's $20 for one and $22 for another. But for $40, you'll have every piece of information on the Social Security
You know, when you
record.
go online, it always tells you that there's a Social Security application, but then when you look at the image, it's always, blank.
Right.
And so this is the next step then, would be to do
Correct.
that. One of the other things, I think last time we were looking at a Social Security application, and it was asking for the exact name of the parents. I mean, maybe it was just 1 or 2 years when they did that, but that was really good because it said the full name, and so there you might get a middle name or something. So that was
more
useful.
clues.
Yeah.
One of the other things for men, World War I and World War II, draft registration cards, particularly World War I, because the law was very strict. The government wanted everybody, so it wasn't just citizens. Every man who was living here was supposed to register, and those cards can be really, really helpful for finding that information.
They give the next of kin, or they
The
give
next of kin,
either the wife's
who
name
the
or
parents
something.
were, and all kinds of good information. But the fact that it was not just citizens,
Correct.
Yeah.
Everybody.
it was everybody, and reading the law, the only ones that got away were ones that people who came into the country, or men who came in after the 1917 registration, unless they decided to become a citizen. Then they were not exempt. But if they were living here in 1917, whether they were a citizen or not, they were to register. The government was dead serious about that registration.
Oh, well, we may not always approve of everything the government does, but boy, when we're looking for people, we are grateful for every question they ask.
That's right.
And every form that had to be filled out. Oh, my goodness. So some other areas maybe that people think about or maybe just overlook because they're right there, are documents at home, like photographs and Bibles and any kind of correspondence. And so consequently, we'll maybe look at pictures in an album with an ancestor, an older, maybe not an ancestor, maybe an older family relative, but do we ask, do you know where this picture was taken?
Yes,
Do you know who this person's, mother and father were. Was this the name that they always used?
Yeah.
Did they ever use a nickname? So,
If you're even lucky to have a name on the back of the picture so that you know who you're looking at.
well, here's an example of one that was in my grandmother's album that I just love because it was this particular man who's my grand uncle and his mother, and they're identified on the back.
Oh, that's
they sent it
perfect.
to my grandmother here in America, and of course you can see my English writing because I had to have somebody tell me what that foreign handwriting was. But yes, we should look on the back of photos, and the photos we have we need to tag
Yes.
digitally and write on as well. One that I mentioned earlier, but I feel like we should go back to are will and probate records in the United States. At the Maryland Archives, I'm involved in a project where the Family Search is digitizing all the will and probate records at the Maryland Archives. And these go back, Maryland is an original colony, so wills were legal documents. Many of these documents go back to the early 1700s.
Wow.
So consequently, it's the immigrant who is making out his will. We have found documents there where when money was distributed from the estate, it was, on that document was written the name of the person in the old country and where that person lived in the old country.
Oh,
So we
great.
have villages and we have original surnames in these will and probate files. We don't think about wills and probates as a way to jump the pond, but if we do a thorough search for our ancestors' will and probate records, we may find some surprises there.
Oh, those things can be loaded with good stuff. In Poland, I didn't exactly find a will, but the land records had life estate information and then named the children, and when the parents were to die, here's what, down to, you know, how many pieces of firewood they were going to have. It was fascinating. And that was so, and actually today sometimes land records will have who the,
Especially early U.S. land
Yeah.
records, like Chuck, when your family came over early.
Well, Carol, we are almost out of time. We appreciate you coming over
thank
from
you.
Maryland to visit us.
Yes,
And
thank you.
we'll be
being here.
anxious
Thank
to
you.
hear more about your projects in Greece next year.
Thank
When
you.
you're going back this summer. And
Oh, I'm going back.
Janelle wanted to mention the Mount Vernon Society.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to invite everyone to come join us at the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. We are on 1500 Shenandoah Road here in Alexandria. Every month we have a speaker. In fact, I think Carol's going to be speaking in January, and we've got a whole list of speakers for the rest of the year. Please join us. Also, we have training, we have a research center, and you're all very welcome. Thanks again, Carol.
Thank you very much
You'll
for
be
this
there
opportunity.
next Tuesday.
Yeah.
I will.
Yeah,
I will.
looking
I'm doing
forward
alien
to that.
registration files.
Wonderful.
So
That's-
you'll get to see